Sara Moslener has been studying evangelical purity culture for over 15 years and is the author of Virgin Nation, Sexual Purity and American Adolescence. She and her work have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Cosmopolitan Magazine, The Revealer, among others. Her current research, the After Purity Project, collects stories from people who've grown up and out of evangelical purity culture and situates them within broader histories of evangelicalism, sexuality, and white Christian nationalism. Her work is supported by the Louisville Institute and the Religion and Sexual Abuse Project. She is a lecturer in the Department of Philosophy and Religion at Central Michigan University. We have a fun, unique, and interesting conversation with Sara. Please enjoy the time, be stretched, be challenged, and do what we do. Just be open-minded and listen. Sara, hey.
Hi.
Happy afternoon. I guess you're Eastern time too, so that makes
Thank
it easy.
you. Yes.
So I read the title, and I feel like every time I read the title, I get the shivers of what people are going to think on the other end if they're watching this, which a lot of our audience might already be like, oh, I'm interested. But, we have a few people like family members who might think otherwise. But thank you so much for taking out the time to hang out with me for a little bit and talk about your book and some of these issues.
Yes, I am so delighted to be here. I'm always excited to talk about this topic, and it's only become even more. Since I published the book, it's only become even more relevant. So my ideas are still growing and developing, and so having conversation partners is just my favorite thing in the world. So thank you so much for having me.
Totally. Remind me when it was published again.
2015.
Okay. Yeah. So I agree. I feel like the last 2 years, and I'm going to use Kristen's book as the example. For me, I feel like when Jesus and John Wayne came out, I think that coupled with COVID, it just kind of spiked. And now there's this growing interest of understanding Christian nationalism, the evangelical identity we had growing up and things like that. So it's cool to see what you were already doing, and it's all kind of tying together. So. Yeah. So one thing, I was reading your book, I went into it very unknowingly and had even my own bias going into it, right? Thinking this is what this book's about. And I was like, this is actually completely, it was about sexual purity in that culture, but took a turn towards Christian nationalism and understanding the way our nation has embraced some of these concepts. And that was unique for me, and also very telling of my childhood. And I felt a lot of it was speaking to my experiences. So I guess let's start quickly with just defining what that means. What is purity culture? What was the purity movement? What is the sexual purity movement? And kind of maybe once that definition is given for the audience, then we can talk about history of it, right?
Yeah. So I've been thinking about this. This is a question I get asked a lot and think about a lot is, to define it and also to think about a starting point for it. And I think what I want to do is what I've decided is important to do is to really start in the 19th century when we are defining evangelical purity culture. Most people overwhelmingly started in the 1990s with organizations like True Love Waits, especially. Some people started in the 1970s with the rise of the moral majority, what I refer to far too mildly as the Evangelical Republican Alliance, which now just seems so inappropriately mild that it's embarrassing. But I really think that we need to go back to the 19th century in order to understand purity culture, emerging out of first wave feminism and emerging out of a form of evangelical Protestant Christianity in which these ideas were so inherently tied to ideals of what today we would call white Christian nationalism. That is, that white women in particular, and as sexually pure, divine creatures, really embodied the progress, embodied the blessing of God on the nation state. And so, and this is regardless of white women's actual lived experiences. And I think that's something we need to keep in mind, that purity culture is an idealistic frame that does not represent people's experiences. So, say we flash forward to the 90s, and I was one of those kids caught up in purity culture. I wrote about it for my local my local newspaper and saying, absolutely, we should be teaching abstinence-only education. And I felt like I was taking a stand for it, that I was taking a stand for a way of life that I believed to be marginalized, and yet I also believed to be essential for the well-being of things far beyond my person, far beyond my own family. And that if everyone just sort of saw the wisdom of this, then we would be in a much better world. So there's something very totalizing, throughout history of sexual purity rhetoric. And so what I'm interested in now is really the disjuncture between this idealized rhetoric and the stories of people who have lived through it, and the racist violence that it has been used to justify. So that's the starting point for me in defining what purity culture is.
Yeah. Okay. So before we dig into the 19th century and how that got started, I'm thinking okay, purity culture from a very simple, one-liner would be this idea of coming into your relationship with Christ with no blemish, and usually via sexual purity, abstinence, not having sex before marriage. And even ironically within marriage, maybe it's very boxed and confined. Yeah. And I do want to hit quick disclaimer, and maybe I'll do this in every episode. If you're watching this or if you're listening to this and you feel feelings when you hear words like white or Christian nationalism or racism, or any of those things make you feel weird or uncomfortable, good. This is not a conversation for a bunch of leftists or liberals. We're not using definitions. We are humans trying to have conversation. So if it makes you uncomfortable, I challenge you to stick with it if the topic interests you. Because to your point, Sarah, I think lived experience is the place where we really need to start with how we define things and move and progress forward as a society. So okay. So purity culture, understanding that, let's take a step back. Victorian era, 19th century. Tell me more, because yes, my definition was true love waits and maybe moral majority in the 70s and Woodstock, but let's take it back 100 years.
Right. So we have to go back to Victorian gender roles, which themselves were an ideal. They were a racialized and classed ideal in order to promote the prominence of white Protestant middle class families, and those ideals, which in the 1970s were then picked up by people like James Dobson and a whole host as being biblical, right? So this is one thing we need to understand, that oftentimes what is promoted as biblical gender roles within evangelicalism is in fact referring to Victorian gender roles. And this is why I think sexual purity re-emerged within evangelicalism, because it was a way to return to that particular set of gender roles, which in their historical context were very empowering for white women, because it said, because there was a shift from the long-standing Christian stereotype that women are evil temptresses, and so you have how many centuries of that, right, with sort of the figure of Eve being cast as
how dare you ate
right?
the apple. What?
Right. So something happens in the 19th century where that completely flips. And now it's white women who are perceived as having an innate spiritual connection to the divine, and part of that because of their innate sexual purity, lack of interest in sex beyond motherhood, and that gets extrapolated into these virtues of nurturance and of advancing the civilization. We see, prominent leaders like Frances Willard, who ran the Women's Christians Temperance Union, one of the most powerful women's organizations in the 19th century, sort of using this rhetoric as a way to promote women's political enfranchisement. And ultimately, this helped lead to voting rights for white women. But in doing that, it had to rely on these racialized stereotypes about sexual purity. And there are numerous women in that period who are not white who were saying, what about us? Right? We are also women. We are also cultivators of civilization. We are going to claim this. There were Black women in the WCTU who taught purity within Black communities. Ellen Frances Watkins Harper, who's most well known for her poetry, was one of the women to do this. And so there was pushback even then against the racialization of sexual purity that really offered white women a place of privilege, both in actuality and also symbolically. Now, this is going to culminate in a very violent historical moment around the practice of racial terror lynchings in the South, which are going to be justified primarily through the belief that white women who are innately sexually pure are being threatened by Black men. And this was, this is what Ida B. Wells called the lynching myth, and she wrote about it extensively. She did extensive work. If you want to look up her Red Record, amazing historical document about and her investigations into lynchings and why they happened. And what she discovered was that, in fact, there was rape accusations were completely fabricated. And in many cases, these were consensual relationships between Black men and white women. And so she really pulled back the cover on that. But when she went to publicize that, she got pushback from people like Frances Willard, who were unwilling to acknowledge that white women might possibly have sexual relationships outside of marriage and might have them with men of color, right? So there's all of this racialized anxiety built into sexual purity in our national DNA, much less evangelicalism.
So we're talking like late 19th century, like, are we talking about the 80s, 90s, 1880s, 90s?
Right. So lynching really hit its peak in the 20s. Okay. And so I think the latest, there's still rumors of it happening today, but it was, the most famous, of course, being, I almost said Trayvon Martin. But the latest being Emmett Till. Mm-hmm. I think I've thought a lot about how those two figures play similar roles in the history of civil rights. But, right. Emmett Till, the rumor was he said something untoward to a white woman. And we know now from interviews with her, she is still alive, that she lied about it. But it was just enough for, her family members to kidnap him and kill him. So
I'm curious to take it back. So like white women had this like tunnel vision on them regarding sexual purity, but it seems like no one else, no other white males, obviously no other ethnicities, African Americans.
Right. And
that was just a cultural reality.
Yeah. And it's this interesting, and it still very much exists because it's this interesting positionality in which white women are granted privilege, right? In so many ways, right? There's race privilege. There's the privilege of being of having the right to be comforted, of having the right to security, to being protected. Mm-hmm. But it's all in service to these larger racialized dynamics that work to maintain, back in the day they called the color line or the race line. I mean, sexual purity ideology really emerged after slavery, when people were deeply anxious, when white people were deeply anxious about racial boundary crossing, about miscegenation. It's interesting to track sexual purity rhetoric alongside, miscegenation law and laws that wouldn't let people of different races marry and have sex and have children. Those laws were in place until 1965. So sexual purity has this deeply entrenched history that comes out of this early this first wave feminism, and is something that then gets picked up. And in my book, right, the next place I go to is Billy Graham, who starts making similar claims about the importance of sexual purity to national security. And so you see, and so the language of civilization, and sort of civilizational advancement that was used in the 19th century, early 20th century, gets transformed by Graham into the language of national security in the context of the Cold War.
Yeah. So, and I mean, we're talking a little bit later on. Graham comes along, obviously has a huge reach. Let's talk about national security, because that was one thing for me reading your book that was like, I never put those together. Yeah. Because and then we could probably quickly and easily lead into apocalyptic conversation too, because they're kind of hand in hand. So there's this national security side, Cold War fears, which is ironic that we're having this conversation now, given the circumstances of today. And then, but also kind of the theological of apocalyptic belief and end times and things like that. So yeah, talk to me about national security. Why, like how that tied in via Graham, and even, I don't know if G. Stanley Hall plays into that a little bit, or
so Hall was coming out of the Victorian context and was still very much talking about civilizational advancement, and he was especially concerned with the adolescent development of boys, and had a lot of his own sexual anxieties because of some stuff that he endured as a child. And so he, so it's interesting to sort of read him alongside 19th century first wave feminists whom he kind of deplored because he really felt that they were detracting from this ideal masculinity that he was trying to promote, that really, took shape within adolescence when young men were able to resist sexual temptation and allow their growing religious convictions to control their sexuality, right? So that's So that's what he's trying to do. And so Graham, I've never been able to draw any connections between Hall and someone like Billy Graham. I think they're just in very different universes, and yet they're drawing on similar, it's just really interesting that Graham's going to pick up on this. And one of his sources is actually a sociologist who I believe started the sociology department at Harvard, but he was a Soviet refugee. His name was Petrum Sorokin, and he wrote a book called the Great American Sex Revolution. And he really made the argument that, look, the stakes are high, and sexual morality is the cancer that will eats a nation from the inside, and therefore makes it more susceptible to attack from the outside. And certainly had some very unfavorable comparisons with family life and sexuality in what was then the Soviet Union. So so that's what Graham is going to read. He's also a big fan of Edward Toynbee, and so one of the things that Graham did was that he wanted to bring fundamentalism sort of out of its intellectual mud pit and really sort of give it some intellectual credibility. And Sorokin and Toynbee were two of the academics that fit into his into this fundamentalist worldview that really highlighted this end times theology and how that needed to shape people's moral behaviors, especially the moral behaviors writ large on a national level.
Right. Now I'm just okay. So so Graham is promoting this idea of national security, and I'm trying to put myself in that time period, right? And it's like, okay, it's 40s, 50s, 60s. They're obviously very conservative culture, still a lot of other issues, whether they denied them or embraced them, like the civil rights movement. But, it's like, okay, they believed this could prevent from exposure or whatever it might be from whatever fears of external threats. But we're now existing 70 plus years later, and nothing much has really happened in terms of this crazy, we are now infiltrated by all the evil. I guess they still believe that, but what's that connection? If nothing's really changed in the sense of where our economy is growing, as a society, we are growing. We seem to be all the shit going on. It still seems to be pretty decent and increasing even with all the other problems. Why are people still so scared? Right.
Well, yeah, from a Christian nationalist perspective, right, it hasn't gotten better. Right. And especially when you add the apocalyptic piece to it, there's something, you can place sort of moral decline as part of the trajectory, toward, apocalyptic destruction. And that is going to be, and Billy Graham is really going to work that into evangelical rhetoric in a really powerful way. And then, people like Dobson are going to pick it up. Jerry Falwell is going to pick it up, right? And you're just going to, in fact, one of the groups that I studied in my dissertation was a group called Silver Ring Thing. And they had at one point, and I don't know if they ever used it, but they produced a video based on an original video based on an original song, which went through a whole series of dangerous things that a young child was doing. And so the whole thing was a fable about, the permissive parent, saying, oh, and so the child comes in and says, I'm building a fire for the gods. And the permissive mother says, well, use protection, right? And then they come in and say, oh, I'm building, a home for illegal aliens, right? We'll use protection. And all of these, then something harmful happens to the child, right? And then the last thing is, this is the buildup to, the permissive parent allows their child, provides their child with condoms. And the refrain after that says, if you use a condom, and so I can't remember the exact line here, but, if you're using a condom, it's like playing with a nuclear bomb. You could wipe out the whole human race, right? So this is in the early 2000s that you see a purity group drawing on this Cold War apocalyptic narrative as a way to, to evoke sort of the danger of safe sex. And it was at that point when I saw that I realized what the narrative was here, that the narrative I was piecing together was not first and foremost about young people making pledges and struggling to understand, being a faithful Christian and having sexual desire. That's what I thought I was studying. Right. But it turned out to be these much deeper and broader currents that went all the way. And so I started looking, where are there connections between sexual purity, sexual morality, and fears of national decline? And I just started working backwards, and they just all popped up.
I mean, like reading your book, I'm like, ding. Ding.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's like, okay, because what I always get curious, I'm like, well, how long are you going to keep waiting for this crazy apocalyptic thing to happen? I mean, right. Graham's saying it 50 to 70 years ago.
Right.
And to you, the evangelical who is very strong in their apocalyptic end time belief,
right,
is, I guess it's decreasing or things are getting worse in your eyes. But maybe let's get a little theological for a second. Like, so you do touch on it in your book, the idea of pre and post millennialism. Obviously, like you have like the church mainstream at large, which was for the most part amillennial. And we don't need to get into like Darby and millennialistic dispensational theology, but it seems like that's feeding a lot of what people are believing, which at this point, I would love to hear your thoughts, but like, it seems like it's so splintered and people don't even know their history enough to know Darby or whoever, but like it's so splintered. Once you believe something like premillennialism or whatever, the apocalypse is coming, therefore moral decline, therefore I must save my kids by sexual purity, whatever it is.
Right.
It's there's no really return from that belief, but how did you see theology of millennialism and the idea of the apocalypse playing? You see that kind of playing into all this?
Yeah. It was surprising because I thought I was looking at something that was not tied up in that, because I also talk in the book about, evangelicalism of the 1970s was this weird moment because you have, Hal Lindsey's late great Planet Earth, right? And you have all people getting really caught up in apocalyptic narratives, but you also have what I call I'm losing my words here. I call the psychological or the therapeutic turn in evangelicalism, where it's more concern, it's less fear-based and more, what eventually will become your best life now. Right. That it's all about personal flourishing and that God wants these best for you. Right. So you have these tensions between the apocalypticism coming out of the Cold War, and what is the prosperity gospel. I think it's, I don't know if you know Caitlin Beatty, who's she's a publisher at Brazos Press and has written about purity culture, but she has named it a sexual prosperity gospel, which I think is so incredibly apt to think about that. So you do have these tensions within evangelicalism between something that's more willing to accommodate the modern moment and what people need, but also being willing to make these larger claims about a providential historical narrative. What's interesting, after the last 3 years, it's hard to see. I would say after the last 8 years, I think with sort of the election of Trump and realizing, sort of the evangelical regime that sort of came to power with him, is very interesting to think about the kind of apocalyptic theologies that are coming from that. And certainly then with the pandemic, right? It makes sense to me that apocalyptic theologies are going to be everywhere, in the midst of a pandemic. How could they not be? I just read something today, posted by someone today in response to what is happening with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And it basically said, United States, we are in no place to defend ourselves because we have not done the moral work, right? So basically a call for, I think the words were discipline and discipline and morality, right? Which is purity culture talk, for saying like, look, we need to get right with God in terms of our national morality if we have any hope of really being successful militarily in this conflict, right?
It's so hard to like hear that, because I feel like I want to like have hope, right? Like I want to, and when I say hope, I mean like as simple as let's start having conversations, right? But like I want to have hope that we can come to terms of agreement. But I feel like there's so many foundational issues. What's America, right? Like what makes us a nation, right? What makes the idea of church first state? What makes the idea of freedom and liberty for all people? These like basic principles that we literally a generation ago were dealing with and still are dealing with. But I guess like I'm trying to think of how even the thing today and what you just quoted with Russia invading Ukraine, like that's not a new rhetoric. Like you're triggering things in me. Like I grew up going to these crazy things, calling for moral things or for moral livelihoods to increase, but nothing's changed. Just same rhetoric. So I don't know what I'm saying there other than like, it's discouraging. Cause I'm like, you guys have been saying the same thing for as long as I've known 10, 20, 25 years. What's really different, okay. So national security tied to sexual purity, a lot of this due to Cold War, apocalyptic theological understanding, that only seems the polarization of that only seems to be increasing, in my opinion. People I know that are kind of in the camp of apocalyptic morality and stuff like that. I'm curious today, and I do want to touch on like the 90s, just because I think a lot of our audience probably grew up in it, but like, what are you seeing today in terms of the stories you're hearing? Like, in other words, we touched on at the beginning, like what are people's experiences? And maybe this is where my hope comes in, because all of us who were teenagers being inundated with these concepts and beliefs, a lot of us are coming out of it because we're just thinking. And I apologize if someone's offended because I'm insinuating they're not thinking. But so maybe it's just a time game, and in 20 years it's going to be better because a lot of us are out of it, and then we're teaching our kids differently and things like that. But are you seeing that change in terms of people's experiences, people realizing? I don't know. Tell me about kind of your current work.
Right. I mean, the backlash to purity culture of the 90s, I started studying it in 2006. The first real public pushback started between 2008, 2009. And those were very mild liberal feminist critiques coming, I think of Lauren Winner's book, The Naked Truth About Real Sex, The Naked Truth About Chastity, in which she ultimately affirms the teachings, but says, hey, we got to question some things about this. And that was just the beginning. And so I have watched the unfolding of what I call a post-purity movement, and the cascade after cascade of stories being told. And the narratives are incredibly consistent. And what that tells me is that this was never a project about the well-being of human beings. It was always first and foremost about obtaining political power and social control. Because, and of course it still exists. There are still people promoting it, but the opposition is just, a cacophony.
I mean, you can't argue with the apocalyptic nationalistic rhetoric, because if that's your belief, there's really no conversation to be had then, because
right. Yeah.
Unfortunately.
So it's interesting to watch this along with the hashtag evangelical movement, and to see the overlap there. So now I forget your original question, and that's
okay. So what then? Because I try to see things from both sides, even though that's really hard to do sometimes. What, if this is my belief, and let me take a step back. Why do you think? And this is probably a really stupid answer, but why are they so threatened? Why, they being people who believe in Christian nationalism or the national security component, apocalyptic theology? Yeah. Why are they threatened by what you're saying, for example?
I'm trying to think back when I was in that world, and I think there is, it all comes down to having a singular, undeniable, unrelenting truth that offers security and certainty. I mean, this is something, when I left evangelicalism, I realized I was giving that up. I realized I needed to, because that it felt deeply untrue to me to say there is a singular truth. And that's in, this apocalyptic theology that we're talking about, white Christian nationalism. It's, that's its real power in that it is a singular narrative for human redemption, and one that is wielded to mark boundaries between the saved and unsaved. And this is, when I teach about religion and race, we start 500 years ago, because that's where these dynamics were really put in place, that there is one way and only one way, and everything else is a path to destruction. And so And so I understand why people are attracted to that. I grew up in it. It was very safe. I was very protected. I had a very safe childhood. My parents worked very hard for that. And my parents were very committed to the Dobson family model. My father, has his doctorate from Fuller Seminary in marriage and family therapy.
Wow.
And
so you were really in it.
Yes. Yeah. So it's, right. So it's a way, and the thing is, it's very easy then when it gets into, and this is why I think it's so important, even in times like this, when people are so invested in what's happening politically, we always need to go back to the family. We always need to go back to gender and sexuality, because that's where we see the real impact of these ideologies. And so I get really frustrated when I hear usually my male colleagues talking about the decisions that powerful men are making, which of course was the decision I made in my book. I thought I was going to be studying young people, young women, talking about, agency and empowerment and spirituality and sexuality. And I ended up with a book studying the most powerful white men in evangelical history, right? So I understand the need to focus on those power players, but I also am constantly feeling the urge to say, okay, let's get out of the halls of power and get into the suburbs and think about what's going on in white families. What are the stories that white families are telling about themselves, about what is best for them? Because most evangelicals, that is where they're living. Right. Yeah. And something like purity culture has been able to connect the halls of power with, the white suburban family in ways that easily obscure those connections. And so then in moments where you need to, and of course, this is really handy for like the Republican Party when they have a candidate like Donald Trump, right? We know white women in the suburbs, right, overwhelmingly voted for Trump. And I think it's because evangelicals were very successful at connecting the halls of power with the white suburban family.
Yeah.
And by the way, I want to plug here Sophie Bjork James's work. I don't know if you know her work. She is are you in Nashville or Memphis?
I'm actually in Chattanooga.
Oh, in Chattanooga. My apologies.
No, you're good.
But she is at Vanderbilt. And She has written a book called The Divine Institution about the white evangelical family, which if anyone's looking for a follow-up to Virgin Nation, just go right there. Yeah. And I've learned, so her book just came out, I believe, last summer, 2 summers ago. And I've learned so much from it in terms of how, the model American family is the white evangelical family. And that is a deeply religious and deeply racialized project of white supremacy.
Yeah. I mean, I like what you said earlier about being safe and secure. There's so many layers to these things.
Yeah.
But I do feel like there is some rooted foundation on this idea of safety and security, which the opposite would be fear if it's unknown, the fear of what is not known. And it was just such a unique time because you have global communication, social media, access to anything, versus back in the day. It kind of boggles my mind when I think about like how influential like Dobson was on all of our lives, on my life, as a singular option, really. And what else was there? There wasn't a whole lot. And that's kind of crazy to think about. There was one major voice on psychological family rearing. Like,
yeah. And he was the dominant. I mean, and that is what was so, powerful, is that he was presumed. In fact, I assumed this for a long time, even in graduate school, that he was not political. Right. That he was caring about families. And somehow, there was a time when evangelicals were like, oh, we don't want to be political, right? We're just taking care of families. Right. But of course that was an entirely political project, but they felt like they couldn't admit that. Right. But he, for decades, was the most powerful evangelical political figure. And I think, and there've been some amazing, I've had colleagues who've written amazing books about the impact of focus on the family. It was really interesting to watch it, kind of implode, I guess now about a decade or so ago. And I thought, well, and of course then in its wake, all these other groups, kind of spring up, and you get, and you get sort of a mushrooming of all these other
even Silver Ring thing changed their name, right? So I mean, they, people might be like, oh, Silver Ring thing, I that was so terrible. And it's like, well, eventually you're not even going to see that anymore because
exactly
new name. So
yeah,
if we can invest in our family and our children, like my parents relied way too much on Dobson, everyone to tell them what to believe. And yet my parents were completely mentally absent. Sure. Love you, mom. Love you, dad. Sorry. They know some of this anyway, but
sure.
And so they actually weren't great parents in that regard, like in the sense of mentally, emotionally developing me. And I feel like that's one of the biggest lacks is we hold tighter on concept of theology or belief instead of just this idea of being present and asking hard questions. And maybe that's what it is. It's like, what does it mean to ask hard questions? What does it mean to engage with uncomfortable conversation? Yes. It's definitely a skill that didn't exist. I'm sure some people had it, and people absolutely had it. Their voices didn't seem to be as loud as the other ones. But I think that's changing. And that's my exhortation to people is like, what does it mean to just listen and to let someone else's experiences be their own experiences, guide them along the way, be present, but embrace them holistically for who they are. I don't know why it would need to be any other way. Of course, the retort to that is like, what? Come back to me when your child says they want to be gay or whatever. And it's like, I'll come right back. And I'll be like, hey, still going out to weekly dates and hanging out and doing whatever. So,
Right. And it's interesting to see then where the boundaries come down. Right. And it seems to be now the boundaries are coming down right in front of LGBTQ kids. Yeah. And that's, And it's the same, thing. It's the same principle. It's just a new, most recently with anti-trans, trans stuff coming out of places like Texas, it's the same ideology at work.
Yeah.
And it's like, where do we, and I see, I try and follow evangelical Twitter as much as my well-being will allow.
Yeah, right.
And it's really, and to sort of see people say, and it's, the defining boundary markers around evangelicalism are not around Christ, are not around, even an authentic engagement, entangling with scripture. They're around gender and sexuality. And that is because it's evangelicals. That's been the way that evangelicals have been able to maintain political and cultural prominence.
Man, I mean, you're right. It's literally the defining thing. It was the defining thing for my childhood. And I wanted to ask, like, when we were talking about the Victorian time period, I'm not a historian. I love reading. I love the humanities, but was it not fairly true in that time period? Like, it was common for men to have pretty free reign to explore and experiment before marriage, such as whorehouses and things like that. Like, that was a common thing, right?
Well, and it's interesting because this is what's so interesting about the first wave purity movement, as you might call it, right, within first wave feminism, because it was about holding men accountable in creating a single standard of sexuality, right? And so part of the political work was outlawing prostitution. And so because what a lot of anti-prostitution campaigners found was that, women's lives were ruined by prostitution. And the assumption being that women didn't choose it, that men seduced them into it, or that once you are ruined, that is all you can do with your life.
But of course, they probably fed into that. Like once they were told that, well, I guess I'm in the whorehouse. So it kind of did ruin their lives in the sense of if you actually had ambition, well, it's fucked at that point. So you might as well just...
Exactly. Yeah. And then, of course, men with impunity, could visit prostitutes with impunity. And I think, and so there was this, so the first wave feminism was trying to rectify that. But what's interesting is that pieces of that then have been picked up in the late 20th century, and you look at like, that's why, white evangelicals could get behind Trump, right? Because there is this expectation that as long as women are holding the boundary marker, then white men can do what they need to do to be the effective leader, even if that means they're taking advantage of certain liberties. You can excuse that.
Like grabbing pussy comments.
Exactly.
I mean, but it doesn't matter because he's accomplishing God's will by helping things like banning abortion or whatever.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's sad. And it's funny because I know people might hear me talk or hear you talk and just presume like our strong political beliefs. But the funny thing is, like, it's so much more complex than that in terms of like any sort of political reality. It's more just when can we engage in the hard conversations of accountability. Like, I don't hear a lot of evangelicals really remorseful over Ravi Zacharias. I don't hear people, going, oh, Jerry Falwell Jr., it doesn't make sense to me. I'm like, hold your belief. That's fine. But don't elevate it to a point that impacts the entire nation, especially when your theoretical leaders are the ones actually perpetuating the issues. So, I mean,
exactly.
Anyway, that's a whole rant fest we could go on, I'm sure. But okay, well, Sara, we've been talking for a while. I'm really thankful for the time. I guess, like, kind of to wrap things up for people listening, like what do you see on the horizon? What are you seeing as you keep researching the practical side of what you want to see? What's your encouragement and exhortation of people? What do you want to say to them?
I have seen, the emergence of what I call this post-purity movement. And within that are people who are doing a lot of caregiving work and developing resources to think more deeply about authentic sexuality. There are so many people now who, it's a cottage industry of people who will help you work through the damage caused by purity culture. And there's something really beautiful about that. And I say that tentatively because, some things can always go sideways. You're always in danger of replicating similar dynamics. But there is a growing number of scholars working on this topic and trying to understand it from both the individual perspective of, sort of the variety of harm that it has caused people's lives, but also to the broader perspective of like, how does this connect, to the rhetoric people are using to talk about, Russia invading Ukraine, right? So there's a real opportunity here to connect the interpersonal with the systemic. And to me, that's really exciting because that gives us, I think, a greater understanding of how we as human beings live together, and how we can, and the kind of things that help us really achieve a place of being fully human. I see a lot of people doing that work who have come out of evangelicalism and purity culture. And so I see a lot of hope there. So the people who are promoting purity culture right now will still be here in a decade when they're rolling out of it and trying to figure things out all over again. So I think there is, right, as I said, I just sort of see these cascades, in this of people working through this. And that's really my focus. And that's where I try and stay focused rather than being overwhelmed. Because I like the quote I gave you, the thing I told you about, this person on Twitter talking about, the United States isn't prepared. It's morally not prepared. That guy has like 36 Twitter followers, right? Yeah, so right. That's right. So I look at that and that gives me hope. Right? Like, okay, this idea is out here, but these other voices are so much more powerful because they're authentic. Mm-hmm. I want to make space to problemize the notion of authenticity because I think that's important. But I think there is a sense of people speaking from their experience and from what they have learned and being in a place where, and using that to get them to a place of openness and curiosity. And once a person gets there, there's so much, right? And you can't, and the thing about it is that like you're moving into a space where people are not dictating to you what a good life looks like. And actually the work is on you to figure that out. Right. And so I think, what it means to be good, what it means for sex to be a good, for our bodies to be a good. And I just see so much possibility in that space. And there's always possibility for it to go sideways. And I've seen it happen in real time. But that's a space I can work in and hope to invite more people into.
Yeah, totally. Well, obviously I have all these other questions. We could have gone in all these other directions. I highly encourage, if you watch this or are listening, to check out Sara Moslener's book, Virgin Nation. It's available on Amazon, Kindle, or paperback. It's interesting, right? It's history. She's a historian. So just go challenge yourself. If it's not the topic you would generally read it. I mean, it was challenging for me at certain points, and it was really fascinating having grown up in that. So, but here we are attempting to just be more curious. Let us continue on that path. So Sara, thank you so much for having some time to hang out and chat. And
absolutely, Michael. Thank you so much. It's been great.
Absolutely. Well, brothers and sisters, get mad, stay blessed. We'll talk soon.
Get mad. Get mad, Priest Coffee.